This hearing of the Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations, will commence our hearing. Today we have a hearing titled "The Role of BP in the Deepwater Horizon Explosion and Oil Spill." We have a number of members present for this hearing who are not members of the subcommittee, but are members of the full Energy and Commerce Committee. I welcome them, and I note that they will be allowed to submit written statements for the record, but will not deliver verbal opening statements. In addition, after all subcommittee members complete their questioning, full committee members will be allowed to ask questions. Members who are not on the subcommittee or on the Energy and Commerce Committee are welcome to observe, but they will not be permitted to provide opening statements or ask questions due to time constraints. The Chairman, Ranking Member, and Chairman Emeritus will be recognized for 5-minute opening statements. Other members of the committee will be recognized for 3-minute opening statements. I will yield to the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for the first opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. And Mr. Hayward, thank you for being here today. Yesterday, BP pledged to establish a $20 billion escrow account and to suspend its dividend payments for the rest of the year. I'm sure these were not easy decisions for you, but they were the right ones, and I commend you for them. Congress has multiple committees examining the Gulf oil spill. Some are evaluating the impact of the spill. Some are working on the reorganization of the regulatory agencies. And some, including Chairman Markey's subcommittee, are drafting legislation to reform our oil exploration laws. You are testifying today before the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, and this subcommittee has a special role to examine the facts and determine what went wrong and to make recommendations to prevent future spills. When it's time for questioning, I and other members of the subcommittee will ask you about a series of internal BP documents. They appear to show that BP repeatedly took shortcuts that endangered lives and increased the risks of a catastrophic blowout. And I sent you a letter in advance indicating that we're going to question you about those issues. But what is equally important is what is missing from the documents. When you became CEO of BP, you promised to focus like a laser on safe and reliable operations. We wanted to know what you had done to keep this promise. So we asked what emails you had received, what documents you had reviewed about the Deepwater Horizon rig or the Macondo well before the blowout. Deepwater drilling is inherently dangerous. As the entire country now knows, an uncontrolled blowout can kill rig workers and cause an environmental disaster. We wanted to know whether you were briefed about the risks and were monitoring the safety of the drilling operation. We could find no evidence that you paid any attention to the tremendous risks BP was taking. We've reviewed 30,000 pages of documents from BP, including your emails. There is not a single email or document that shows you paid even the slightest attention to the dangers at this well. You are the CEO, so we considered the possibility that you may have delegated the oversight responsibility to someone else. We reviewed the emails and briefing documents received by Andy Inglis, the Chief Executive for Exploration and Production, and Doug Suttles, the Chief Operating Officer for Exploration and Production, and the person now leading BP's response to the spill. According to BP, these are the senior officials who were responsible for the Macondo well, but they too were apparently oblivious to what was happening. We could find no evidence that either of them received any emails or briefings about the Deepwater Horizon rig or drilling activities at the well. BP's corporate complacency is astonishing. The drilling engineer for the rig called Macondo a nightmare well. Other BP employees predicted that the cement job would fail. Halliburton warned of a severe gas flow problem. These warnings fell on deaf ears. BP's corporate attitude may best be summed up in an email from its operations drilling engineer who oversaw BP's team of drilling engineers. After learning of the risks and BP's decision to ignore them, he wrote, quote, "Who cares? It's done. End of story. We'll probably be fine," end quote. There is a complete contradiction between BP's words and deeds. You were brought in to make safety the top priority of BP. But under your leadership, BP has taken the most extreme risks. BP cut corner after corner to save $1 million here, a few hours or days there, and now the whole Gulf Coast is paying the price. Today's hearing will focus on BP's actions, but we learned from our hearing earlier this week that the other oil companies are just as unprepared to deal with a massive spill as BP. We are seeing in the oil industry the same corporate indifference to risk that caused the collapse on Wall Street. And that is why reform is so urgently needed. Part of this reform must be legislation to put teeth into our regulatory system, but part must also be a transition to a clean energy economy. We're addicted to oil. This addiction is fouling our beaches, polluting our atmosphere, and undermining our national security. We can't snap our fingers or transform our energy economy overnight, but we need to start down a path to a clean energy future. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's hearing, and Mr. Hayward, I thank you for appearing and cooperating with our investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, go to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton of Texas. Mr. Burgess and I will do our openings after the chair and the ranker. Mr. Barton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hayward, for appearing before us. We have kind of a dual track underway, in my opinion. We obviously are trying to gather the facts, what happened in the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a month and a half ago, trying to find out the causes of that spill, what can be done to prevent it in the future. We're obviously very concerned about the mitigation and the cleanup. We have a system in America built up based on the British tradition over 200 years of due process and fairness, where people that do bad things, or in this case a corporation that is responsible for a bad accident, we want to hold them responsible, do what we can to make the liable parties pay for the damages. Mr. Stupak and Mr. Waxman are doing an excellent job working with Dr. Burgess and myself in conducting, I think, a very fair oversight investigation. And we're going to get into a number of those issues in this hearing, and we're going to ask you some pretty tough questions. I'm speaking now totally for myself. I'm not speaking for the Republican Party. I'm not speaking for anybody in the House of Representatives but myself. But I'm ashamed of what happened in the White House yesterday. I think it is a tragedy of the first proportion that a private corporation can be subjected to what I would characterize as a shakedown, in this case a $20 billion shakedown, with the Attorney General of the United States, who is legitimately conducting a criminal investigation and has every right to do so to protect the interests of the American people, participating in what amounts to a $20 billion slush fund that's unprecedented in our nation's history, that's got no legal standing, and which sets, I think, a terrible precedent for the future. If I called you into my office and I had the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Stupak, with me, who was legitimately conducting an oversight investigation on your company, and said, if you put so many millions of dollars in a project in my congressional district, I could go to jail and should go to jail. Now, there is no question that British Petroleum owns this lease. There is no question that BP, I'm sorry, it's not British Petroleum anymore, that BP made decisions that objective people think compromise safety. There is no question that BP is liable for the damages. But we have a due process system where we go through hearings, in some cases court cases, litigation, and determine what those damages are and when those damages should be paid. So I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for anybody else, but I apologize. I do not want to live in a country where any time a citizen or a corporation does something that is legitimately wrong is subject to some sort of political pressure that is, again, in my words, amounts to a shakedown. So I apologize. But on this hearing today, I am with Mr. Waxman, with Mr. Stupak. There are answers that need to be asked, questions that need to be asked that are legitimate, because we don't want another oil spill of this magnitude or of any magnitude in the Gulf of Mexico. And if this subcommittee can do things that make it much more difficult for this type of an incident to occur in the future, then we will have done our work for the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. I'm going to do my opening statement now. Today is the 59th day of the BP oil spill that has devastated much of the Gulf of Mexico. 11 men lost their lives the day the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded, and in the 59 days that have followed, countless people have lost their livelihood as the oil spill closes fishing grounds and pollutes the shores of the 3 states. This is the 3rd hearing of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee has held, and the 5th hearing overall in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Our first hearing exposed problems discovered with the blowout preventer and several other factors that contributed to the disaster. Our second hearing was a field hearing that contributed to the disaster. Our second hearing was a field hearing in New Orleans, where we heard from the widows of 2 men who died in the Deepwater Horizon explosion, as well as shrimpers and other small business owners who have suffered from the environmental catastrophe that followed. Our staff has spent weeks combing through hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, sitting through more than 50 hours of briefings by corporate, governmental, and academic experts in an attempt to piece together what went wrong with BP exploration of the Macondo well. We have reviewed several questionable decisions made by BP in the days and hours leading up to the explosion, and what we have learned so far is alarming. We've learned that time after time, BP had warning signs that this was, as one employee put it, a nightmare well. BP made choices that set safety aside in exchange for cost-cutting and time-saving decisions. For example, BP disregarded questionable results from pressure tests after cementing in the well. BP selected the riskier of 2 options for their well design. They could have hung a liner from the lower end of the casing already in the well and install a tieback on the top of the liner, which would have provided additional barriers to the release of hydrocarbons. Instead, they lowered a full string of the new casing, which took less time and cost less, but did not provide the same protection against escaping hydrocarbons. BP was warned by their cement contractor, Halliburton, that the well could have a severe gas flow problem if BP lowered the final string of casing with only 6 centralizers instead of the 21 Halliburton recommended. BP rejected Halliburton's advice to use additional centralizers in an email on April 16th. A BP official involved in the decision explained, and I quote, "It will take 10 hours to install them. I don't like this," end of quote. BP chose not to fully circulate the mud in the well from the bottom to the top, which was an industry-recommended best practice that would have allowed them to test for gas in the mud. BP chose not to use a casing hanger lockdown sleeve, which would have provided extra protection against a blowout from below. These are just a few of the issues that led to the disaster. Once Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank to the bottom of the sea, BP's response to contain the leak and clean up the spilled oil was equally as poor. They issued lowball estimates of the amount of oil flowing from the well, which may have led to a scaled-back response. We discovered that BP's oil spill response plan was virtually identical to other oil companies' plans. In a hearing Tuesday, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson admitted that once the spills occur, he says, quote, "We are not well equipped to handle them," end of quote. All the other oil companies testified at Tuesday's hearing that they would not have drilled the well as BP did. Our witness today, Mr. Tony Hayward, is the Chief Executive Officer of BP. Shortly after Mr. Hayward took over as the CEO in 2007, he held a town hall meeting with employees in Houston. At this meeting, he discussed the need for BP to be a leaner, with fewer people in decision-making process. This article, and I'll ask you to put up the Guardian article, an article from September 27, 2007, Guardian newspaper in London, titled, "Hayward Says Oil Company Has Become Too Cautious," reads, and I quote, "Assurance is killing us," Mr. Hayward told U.S. staff, noting that too many people were engaged in decision-making, leading to excessive cautiousness, something that critics of its safety performance in the U.S. might question. Let me put up these other notes from the same meeting. We received notes from BP of employees and their note-taking from this meeting. The employee notes summarize Mr. Hayward's statements as follows. "I don't think having all these layers of assurance reduce risk, and it can actually increase it. The best way to reduce risk is to have deep technical competence where we need it. Individuals need to be accountable for risk and to manage it," end of quote. I find this cavalier attitude towards assessing risk unbelievable, given the fact that at the time of these statements, BP had just been responsible for the largest oil leak in Alaska history on the North Slope, as well as the 2005 Texas City refinery explosion, which killed 15 workers and injured another 170. I must ask Mr. Hayward whether it was wise to adopt this leaner decision-making process with input from fewer people and a new approach to managing risk. Under the leadership of Bob Malone, the former chairman and president of BP America, BP created an independent office of the Ombudsman headed by Judge Stanley Sporkin. The Ombudsman office was established because line workers reported fearing retaliation if they reported safety concerns to management. When the current chairman and president, Lamar McKay, took over, I met with him and he suggested that he hoped to improve the culture enough to make the Ombudsman office unnecessary so he could shut it down. I urged him not to eliminate the office because it serves a significant role in investigating employee complaints. I'm more concerned now than ever about BP's safety and the role they take in assuming risk. I'm concerned that the corporate culture, from BP CEO Tony Hayward down to Chairman and President of BP America, Lamar McKay, and Chief Operating Officer Doug Suttle, that there's a willingness to cut costs and take greater risk. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Hayward answer the many hard-hitting questions from our committee members we'll ask today. I hope we will hear honest, contrite, and substantive answers. Mr. Hayward, you owe it to all Americans. We are not small people, but we wish to get our lives back. For the Americans who live and work on the Gulf Coast, it may be years before they get their lives back. For the Americans who lost their lives on the rigs, their families may never get their lives back. Mr. Hayward, I'm sure you will get your life back, and with a golden parachute back to England. But we in America are left with the terrible consequences of BP's reckless disregard for safety. I yield back my time and turn to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Stupak. Today it does open our third hearing, and a very critical hearing, into this subcommittee's ongoing investigation into the tragic accident of the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill, which continues 24 hours a day to wreak economic and environmental havoc on our Gulf Coast. This hearing provides the subcommittee with an important opportunity to directly question the man who ultimately leads BP, Mr. Tony Hayward, the company's Chief Executive Officer. And BP's role has been central to the causes of the incident and to the response. Over the course of our inquiry to date, committee investigators working in a bipartisan fashion have conducted numerous interviews and briefings and reviewed tens of thousands of pages of documents. Our subcommittee staff has done an excellent job, and this subcommittee has been focused on gathering the facts rather than rushing to judgment. And from this intensive effort, we've begun to identify a number of serious questions about BP's decision-making that led up to the disaster. Exploring these and related questions today will help us identify for Congress and identify for the country what went wrong on April 20th and the days thereafter. And while we are investigating, a picture of the chain of events leading to this incident is emerging. Mr. Chairman, you and Chairman Waxman recently outlined some critical questions that we hope Mr. Hayward will address. For example, you noted the investigation has identified questionable choices by BP engineers to use a particular well design over another one that would appear to have provided more built-in barriers to an uncontrolled gas discharge. There was the choice made by BP to move forward with what appears to be an inadequate cementing plan and the related failure, despite clear warnings, to test that the cement was properly set and in place. And it appears there may have been a rush to move off this well. Whether there may have been economic or other time or performance pressures, some combination thereof, it is not clear, but that clarity needs to emerge today. The questions arising from our investigation outline the central role in BP's decision-making appears to have had in this incident. We need to understand that decision-making, Mr. Hayward. What factors influenced it, whether the decisions reflected a management and an operational mindset that failed to maximize safety in a challenging deep-sea environment. It is important to note that the picture developing from this investigation is not one of technological limits in deep-sea drilling. The construction of an 18,000-foot well was not pushing the envelope of engineering know-how so far as we have identified, but the picture developing is one of unsafe industry practices, although clearer, more focused industry standards may be in order going forward. Available evidence suggests that the use of best industry practices would have resulted in more cautious designs and more testing, more safeguards, and ultimately no loss of control of the well. Rather, and quite clearly, the picture developing from our investigation is one of questionable decision-making by people charged with designing and successfully drilling, constructing, and controlling a well that was a mile underwater. It is a picture composed of a series of choices which, taken together, created an oil well particularly vulnerable to a blowout, and of all the people who may have been distracted, unaware, or resistant to recognizing the problems around them. Documents show that BP was prepared to run a test on the quality of the cement job, but chose not to. I can't understand why, given the history of this particular well with 4 previous well control incidents in the 2 months prior to April 20th. The rig personnel appear to have taken their eye off the ball. BP employees were the key decision makers. Certainly others, contractors, subcontractors, certainly federal regulators may have contributed to this incident. The role of the federal government especially, including the overall effectiveness of the response and the efforts to help those harmed by the incident, remains a critical piece that, Mr. Chairman, we must pursue at the level of this committee, and I'm still disappointed that we have not done that. But it is BP's decision-making about the well design, the cementing program, the preparation, the integrity tests, or the lack thereof, or just the general lack of curiosity as to why these would be necessary, the failure to follow best practices that our investigation to date is showing were critical factors in this incident. But this decision-making is difficult to square with the avowed priorities of BP's chief executive. Mr. Hayward, in an interview before you became chief executive, you described how the death of a worker in an operation that you were leading in Venezuela shaped your opinions. You said, and I'm quoting, "I went to the funeral to pay my respects. At the end of the service, his mother came up to me and beat me on the chest. 'Why did you let it happen?' she asked. 'It changed the way I think about safety. Leaders must make safety of all who work for them a priority.'" End quote. Mr. Hayward, I respectfully request that you answer this question in your opening statement, if not for me, then for the 2 ladies who testified before our committee on the field hearing who lost their husbands on the Deepwater Horizon. You've been chief executive since 2007. You said safety is your #1 priority, and you would focus like a laser beam on safety. As chief executive, one would expect your directives and priorities would be carried out by your employees. We have now learned from this investigation that BP employees made 5 critical decisions that may have contributed to well failure where safety was traded off. In fact, it was not the priority. So today, will you assert before this subcommittee that all decisions by BP employees related to the Deepwater Horizon reflected your priority of safety first? Mr. Chairman, the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico shows the consequence of a series of unchecked bad decisions. We in Congress and the federal government must also be mindful of the consequences of bad decision-making. At a field hearing last week in Chalmette, Louisiana, the subcommittee heard some of the administration's decisions are threatening the livelihoods of workers and families who depend upon the energy industry. We've killed half of their fishing with the Deepwater Horizon spill, and it looks like we're going to kill the other half of their economy with our moratorium. Our hearing today looks at the consequences of bad decisions and the lessons learned. May we have the wisdom and humility to take some of those lessons and apply them to ourselves. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I'd next like to turn to Chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee and Chairman of the Select Committee on Climate. Mr. Markey, 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I want to begin by disagreeing in the strongest possible terms with what Mr. Barton said in his opening statement. Not only is the compensation fund that was created yesterday at the White House in an agreement reached between BP and President Obama not a slush fund and not a shakedown. Rather, it was the government of the United States working to protect the most vulnerable citizens that we have in our country right now, the residents of the Gulf. It is BP's spill, but it is America's ocean, and it is American citizens who are being harmed. We cannot wait, as unfortunately so many citizens who were victims of the Exxon Valdez spill had to wait years in order to see those families compensated. We can't lose sight of the fact that the 1984 Bhopal disaster and the lawsuits that were related to it were only settled last week. We have to ensure that the citizens of the Gulf are protected. In a hearing which this subcommittee conducted in New Orleans last Monday, we heard from a fisherman who brought absolutely impeccable records which proved that he and his family had made $27,000 last May. And after examining the documents, BP gave the family $5,000. The families in the Gulf will be crushed financially unless this compensation fund is put into place. As each day and week and month goes by, the history of these families are going to be altered and permanently altered unless they are given the financial capacity to take care of their loved ones, their children, their families. That's why this compensation fund is so important. That's why it is not a slush fund. That is why it is not a shakedown. It is, in fact, President Obama ensuring that a company which has despoiled the waters of our nation is made accountable for the harm which is done to our people. A company which said for the first week that it was only 1,000 barrels of oil per day when we now know that they knew it was at least 1,000 to 14,000 barrels. A company which continues to deny that there are underwater toxic plumes. A company which has not been providing the proper protective gear for the workers in the Gulf. A company which contended it could respond to a spill of 250,000 barrels per day. No, this is not a shakedown of the company. This is the American government, President Obama, ensuring that this company is made accountable and sending a signal to all other companies that seek to treat ordinary American families in a way that can destroy their entire family's history. This is, in my opinion, the American government working at its best. This is creating truly the kind of partnership between the public and private sector that can make sure that innocent victims are not roadkill as a result of corporate plans that did not actually factor in the harm that can occur to ordinary families. So I just could not disagree more strongly. I think that this is, in my opinion, one of the most important hearings that this Congress will ever have, because it is sending a signal to any corporations out there, including the ones that testified on Tuesday that all admitted that they had no plans either to respond to the harm which could be done in the Gulf if one of their rigs had the same kind of catastrophic event, that they will be made accountable. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank you, Mr. Hayward, because yesterday was the day where the page began to be turned, and we moved to a new era where, in fact, your company is made accountable and the citizens of the Gulf are made whole. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. I next turn to Mr. Sullivan for an opening statement. 3 minutes, please, sir.
Chairman Stupak, thank you for holding this hearing today. On April 20th, 2010, a fire and explosion occurred on the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. This terrible disaster resulted in the loss of 11 lives and injured many more members of the 126-person crew. There is no question that the BP oil spill is a tragedy. In fact, it is the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. I believe we must do everything in our power to cap the leak, find out what caused the explosion, and ensure nothing like this ever happens again. BP must bear the entire financial burden for this disaster, and the American taxpayer should not be on the hook for a dime. According to the Occupational Safety Health Administration, there is mounting evidence that BP has one of the worst safety records of any major oil company operating in the United States. To this end, I'm looking forward to examining with Mr. Hayward whether there is a deficient safety culture at BP that led to this disaster and other recent ones, including the BP refinery explosion in 2005 in Texas City, Texas, and a BP pipeline spill in 2007 which released 200,000 gallons of oil into the Alaskan wilderness. Mr. Hayward, why is BP's record on safety so spotty? What is equally as important as our efforts to combat the spill is the knee-jerk legislative reaction from this Congress. Right now, the administration and their allies in the House are more focused on the politics of putting the oil and gas industry out of business than on solutions to the problem. Instead of working in a bipartisan way to push for rigorous safety standards on all offshore rigs, the administration is exploiting this disaster to advance this disastrous cap-and-trade energy policy, which won't stop the well from leaking, but rather will only serve as a national energy tax on the American people, crippling our economy and making the unemployment lines longer. I believe Congress should work towards implementing rigorous safety inspection standards for all offshore rigs, but with nearly 30% of our nation's oil and 11% of our gas reserves located offshore, a ban on offshore drilling will only put Americans out of work. but it will send energy and gas prices through the roof and increase our reliance on foreign imported oil. We still have work to do to uncover exactly what went wrong, and many questions remain on the ongoing efforts to contain the leak. This tragedy should not be used as an excuse to roll back the gains we have made in finding new ways to develop our energy resources, as we will need more oil and natural gas to meet the crucial needs of our nation. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Next, I'd like to hear from the Chairman Emeritus of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Dingell of Michigan, for 5 minutes, please, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I commend you for holding this important hearing today. We sit here on day 59 of the worst environmental disaster in the history of this country. 11 people are dead. The already fragile economy of an entire region is in real danger of shattering. We will be feeling the environmental consequences for years to come. And God Almighty alone knows what the health and environmental effects of the containment and cleanup strategies will be. Millions of gallons of chemical dispersants and control burns. Sadly, we can't even get a decent estimate of the amount of oil and gas that's spewing out into the water. BP has been before this committee many times, and rarely has it been a pleasant meeting, because invariably they have appeared here to defend serious failures on the part of the company. The company has a history of cutting corners, apparently for the almighty dollar. Texas City, they paid their $50 million in criminal fines. Alaska's North Slope, which was investigated by this subcommittee, where a pipe corroded, allowing 1 million liters of oil to spill. In each instance, we were hoping that the assurances given by BP that this would not happen again have been regrettably untrue. In reference to a decision on how to secure the final 1,200 feet of the well, a single casing or tieback, a BP engineer said, not running the tieback saves a good deal of time and money. In reference to installing more centralizers, BP's well team leader said, it will take 10 hours to install them. I do not like this. I am very concerned about using it. So also were we. On the same matter, BP's operations drilling engineer said, even if the hole is perfectly straight, a straight piece of pipe, even in tension, will not seek to center the hole unless it has something to centralize it. I want you to listen to this. But who cares? It's done. End of story. It will probably be fine, and note the word probably, and we'll get a good cement job. I would rather have to squeeze than get stuck, so guard right on the risk-reward occasion. Mr. Chairman, the comments of our witness today reveal little sorrow for the events that have occurred. And here he said, the Gulf of Mexico is a very big ocean. The amount of volume of oil and dispersant we're putting in is tiny in relation to the total water volume. And then the environmental impact of the disaster is likely to be very, very modest. I wonder if he wishes to stand on that statement today. When Mr. Hayward responded to the claims that cleanup workers were becoming ill because of oil fumes and such, he said this, food poisoning is clearly a big issue. And finally, most famously, Mr. Hayward informs us he wants his life back. Last year, Mr. Hayward enjoyed a splendid 41% pay raise, even as BP's profits dropped 45%. Now, I just happen to be a poor Polish lawyer from Detroit, but it seems to me that this is a curious response to a drop in profits. It makes me wonder what the compensation package of our witness will be to this year. Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for your diligence and hard work on this issue. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and look forward to working with you on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, Ms. Blackburn, 3-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and Ranking Member Burgess for holding the hearing today. Mr. Hayward, I thank you for your willingness to testify before this committee. You know, when news of the BP spill began and information about the well started to circulate, it seemed that there was problems not only with BP but also with MMS bureaucracy, and that maybe the problem lay there rather than with anything that could have gone wrong with BP, that it was there with MMS. What we've learned and confirmed that that is not correct, that the problem does lie with BP and what went wrong. And while there are many faults with MMS in doing its job on inspection and safety oversight, most of the data now points to wrong decision-making by BP's management. And this is not the first time, and we've talked about that in several of our opening statements this morning. It's not the first time that you've been before this committee on safety problems, and certainly as recently as the Texas 2005 and Alaska 07 incidents, which revealed insufficient protocols in BP's management and safety hierarchy. There was the statement from BP that you all would, quote unquote, focus like a laser on safety. And it is concerning to us that the appearance is, Mr. Hayward, that BP has not learned from previous mistakes. So it leaves us asking the questions of you and of BP. Was this accident caused by negligence? Was it caused by risk-taking? Was it caused by cost-cutting measures by BP decision-makers? And unfortunately, for citizens, beaches, and wildlife all along the coastal region, they are paying a price for those misplaced decisions. BP cannot blame Mother Nature or equipment failure or even other subcontractors. Their actions have put at risk the livelihood of communities and businesses that depend on the Gulf, not only for seafood and tourism, but also energy production that this nation as a whole relies upon. In addition, the current administration also shares a significant portion of the blame for the oil spill. I mentioned MMS earlier, and the MMS officials approved inadequate spill response plans, and field inspectors rubber-stamped inspection papers submitted by oil companies. This is another area where we as members of Congress, in doing our due diligence, will ask you all and MMS why. But what is the most damaging is that the President and senior officials knew on day one the blowout preventer was not working and knew of the potential spillage. While BP shoulders much of the responsibility for this spill, the lack of effort by this administration to contain the spill has doomed the economy and wildlife of the Gulf Coast from an oil spill which could have been contained. And now recently imposed drilling moratoriums will further devastate America's energy production and will destroy hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Gulf Coast region. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. I next turn to Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Braley, for an opening statement. 3 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hayward, you're not going to get a lecture from me today, and you're not going to get an apology either, because we're here to get to the bottom of the decision-making process that BP followed, and I think, quite frankly, the people who live along the affected area of the Gulf Coast deserve those answers from you. We were in Chalmette, Louisiana last week, and we had the opportunity to hear from a variety of individuals whose lives have been devastated by this oil disaster. And I use the word disaster specifically because I don't think spill quite captures the magnitude of what's going on. The American people are frustrated because we were first told that this was a 1,000-barrel-per-day release, and then about a week later that was updated to 5,000 barrels per day, and then at the end of May it was adjusted upward to 15,000 to 19,000 barrels per day, and then this week we were informed that it could be as high as 60,000 barrels per day. That works out to 2.5 million gallons a day, 17.5 million gallons per week, and over the length of this disaster, it could be up to the level of the largest release of oil in the North American continent in history, unintended. One of the things I think we need to know about today is the decisions that your company made and who made them that led to this explosion and the subsequent disaster, what your company is doing to fix this enormous problem, and about your future commitments to all of the affected workers, families, and communities who've been devastated by this disaster. And I think it would be helpful for you and everybody in this hearing room to hear from the two women who testified at our hearing in Louisiana last week, because they raised some very pointed questions that were directed to your company, sir, and they were questions that were raised after they gave passionate testimony of wanting the oil and gas business to continue in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast region. So I'd like to have you listen to their comments in the hearing. This is Natalie Rostow.
I would like to leave here today knowing that because of my husband's tragic death, we can begin to focus on making safety the most important priority. Not to focus on making more safety regulations, but on ways to effectively implement the ones that we already have. This tragedy will not be in vain, because as of right now, my husband's death is in vain. But it will not be in vain if it serves to make the lives of every man and woman working in the oil field the top priority, and cause these powerful oil companies to know that they will be held accountable for their actions. While I understand companies must make a profit, I do not believe it should be at the expense of risking lives or destroying families. I am asking you to please consider harsh punishments on companies who choose to ignore safety standards before other families are destroyed. My family can never and will never be adequately compensated for our loss.
These are now widows with small children to take care of, and they are the symbols and the faces of this disaster, and I look forward to your testimony. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Next turn to Mr. Gingrey from Georgia for a 3-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to again express my sorrow to the families of those who lost their lives on April the 20th, 2010. Through all the hearings and legislative consideration, we must remember those lives and the lives of their families, as we just saw, that were forever changed on that fateful April day, and we certainly must continue to keep them in our thoughts and in our prayers. Further, we have an obligation not only to those families, but also to everyone affected by the aftermath, to get to the bottom of the causes of this accident and the failure to secure the situation and stop the devastation wreaked upon the Gulf Coast. Mr. Chairman, we have an opportunity in this oversight hearing to ask questions that get to the facts of what happened. However, today's hearing is incomplete. We can only ascertain half of the story today, because we do not have anyone representing the administration, the Mineral Management Service, to discuss their oversight role and their responsibility in ensuring that an accident like this didn't happen. Deep ocean drilling is not new. In fact, we have been doing it for decades in the Gulf Coast. Why did this happen now? I've heard some assert that it was a lax oversight of the previous administration that led to this accident. Well, if that's the case, why did this not happen during the last decade? Why did this occur almost a year and a half into the current administration? We need to hear from our own Department of Interior and the Mineral Management Services. Certainly, Mr. Haywood should be prepared to answer for BP's responsibility, but we will also need answers from the administration so that we can demand accountability and implement prudent reforms to return us to safe drilling in our oceans, because simply saying no to further and new drilling is not a realistic answer. I further realize there are some in this administration who have a penchant for not letting a crisis go to waste. But for a nation dependent on foreign oil, for a nation with unemployment hovering at 10%, we can't just say we can't do this. We can't take our ball and go home when the consequences mean a weaker America. Everyone dependent on foreign fuels, and all too inclined, it seems, to let jobs leave this country. No, Mr. Chairman, we have to understand what happened on and leading up to April the 20th. We need to answer those questions to determine if the rules or the agency oversight were insufficient, or if this was purely an act of negligence or wanton disregard for sound regulations. Now, we can try to enact the perfect reform that ensures this never happens again. But it will not change the past or the toll upon the lives forever change. Mr. Hayward, the responsibility to make these families whole falls to you and your company, BP. You have an obligation to right this wrong, and not only the public trust, but also the belief in the free market and entrepreneurship demand it. Mr. Chairman, I await the opportunity to ask questions with the hope that we will soon discuss these same matters with our own administration. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrey. Ms. DeGette for an opening statement, 3 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, as this is an investigative hearing, I will submit my excellent opening statement for the record in order to have more time for questioning the witness.
Very well. Mr. Doyle, opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this hearing today so we can begin to understand what went so tragically wrong on the Deepwater Horizon. We're now 59 days into this environmental and economic tragedy, and oil continues to gush into the Gulf of Mexico. The estimates for how much oil spills into the Gulf each day continue to rise, and we still have no way to cap the well in the near future. We sit helplessly as we wait for a relief well to be completed. As the details and facts about Deepwater Horizon come to light, it is clear to us all that the decisions made by officials at BP that reflected bad judgment at best and criminal negligence at worst. Through this committee's investigation, we've learned that at nearly every turn, BP cut corners. In well design, the number of centralizers they used, whether to run a cement bond log, circulating drilling muds, and securing the wellhead with a lockdown sleeve, BP took the path of least resistance. On Tuesday, colleagues and competitors from the oil and gas industry provided sworn testimony that they believed BP had delinquencies in well design and failed to follow the best practices of the industry. Now we learned that BP had several warnings about the Macondo well, with one of their own engineers calling it a nightmare well. But instead of treating the well with caution, it seems that BP's only interest was in completing the well quickly and cheaply. Many questions still need to be answered. Were BP employees on the Deepwater Horizon given orders from BP officials to speed up the Macondo well? Were they told to slash costs wherever possible? Why would a team on board the rig to test the cementing of the well be sent home before performing the test? Surely if a cement bond log was ever necessary, it would be in a nightmare well situation. But sending the team home, BP saved $100,000 and 9 or 10 hours of work. Mr. Hayward, I hope you're here today to answer questions about the decision made on Deepwater Horizon that led to this tragic and deadly blowout. Earlier this week, this committee sent you a letter with detailed information about topics we would like you to address today. In reviewing your statement submitted for today's hearing, I'm extremely disappointed in your avoidance of the requested topics. I certainly hope that you use the opportunity today to answer our questions openly and truthfully. I know BP has committed to clean up the Gulf region, and I expect that commitment to be ongoing. I welcome your pledge to pay damages through a $20 billion escrow fund. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Rebuilding the public's trust in your company and your industry will take years and many serious changes in the way you do business. When you operate on our land and in our waters, you're only there because the public's trust has allowed you to be there. You violated that trust in the worst possible way. Mr. Hayward, I look forward to your testimony. I look forward to your answers to our questions and your ongoing efforts to regain America's trust. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Griffith for opening statement, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for calling this important hearing today, and Mr. Hayward for taking time to come before our subcommittee to discuss what happened on the Deepwater Horizon. I know that, like us, your number one priority is stopping the flow of oil. Congress and this committee owe it to the American people to do whatever we can to aid the unified command in reaching this goal. This is a time for engineering and action, and I hope you will let us know what we can do in Congress to be helpful. There are still many questions to be answered about what happened on the Deepwater Horizon, and unfortunately, we do know that the documents that we're reviewing, it does not look good. My hope for our hearing today is that we will be able to put political public relations shenanigans aside and focus on understanding why decisions were made and how BP and the industry can ensure that they learn from this incident so that drilling safely for our valuable resources can continue. And I might say this to you, you're never as good as they say you are or as bad as they say you are. So this hearing will go back and forth. The other thing I'd like to remind the committee is that the greatest environmental disaster in America has been cigarettes. 60,000 Americans today this year will die from cigarette-related cancers. So if we're going to talk about the environment, let's be sure we don't leave that out. I'm a cancer specialist, by the way, by training, and I never fail to bring that up. So the environment is an important concept. We regret the loss of life, but there's much that we can do, and we'll put this in perspective. This is not going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to America. Thank you.
Ms. Schakowsky, 3 minutes opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this very moment, oil is gushing from the Deepwater Horizon blowout at a rate between, we learned, 35,000 and 60,000 barrels a day, killing animals, destroying fragile wetlands, and wiping out entire populations of fish, and along with it, the jobs of hundreds of thousands of people. Most upsetting about this travesty is that it could have been avoided. As the ongoing investigation by this committee has already discovered, BP executives created an atmosphere where safety concerns were ignored in order to ensure that the company's staggering profits this year, approximately first quarter, continued unabated. This appalling disregard for the Gulf Coast and its inhabitants is without question one of the most shameful acts by a corporation in American history. Sadly, the Deepwater Horizon spill is just the most significant example of BP's disregard for the environment and the well-being of its workers. A report published by the Center for Public Integrity found that between June 2007 and February 2010, BP received a total of 862 citations from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Of those, a staggering 760 were classified as being egregious and willful, compared with 8 at the 2 oil companies tied for second place. Inexcusably, this pattern of behavior continued in the spill's aftermath. I hold in my hand a document called Voluntary Waiver of Release that BP made unemployed fishermen sign before they could be hired for spill cleanup. The waiver states, I hereby agree on behalf of myself and my representatives to hold harmless and indemnify and to release, waive, and forever discharge the BP Exploration Production, Inc., from all claims and damages that I or my representatives may have with regard to my participation in the spill response activities. I know that you said this was an early misstep and that this was just a standard document, but this was the first response that you had to people that were hired. And outrage does not begin to express my feeling. These are people who are unemployed because of the recklessness of BP, forced to take jobs cleaning up BP's mess in order to survive. Yet to qualify for those jobs, they had to hold BP harmless for any further damages that they may suffer in BP's employ. This from a company that made $93 million a day. Fortunately, a court trumped your fancy lawyers who wrote this document, but still it begs the question, how could you do that? I'm glad that you're here, Mr. Hayward. I expect you to explain why your company has operated in such a wholly unacceptable manner. In the final analysis, the simple fact remains that if BP had thought more about the residents, as these widows said, and the workers, as these widows said, rather than the already exorbitant profits of its shareholders, we would not be here today. I yield back.
Mr. Latta for an opening statement, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Burgess, I want to thank you for holding the subcommittee hearing on the role of BP and the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion and the ongoing oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. First and foremost, I also want to extend my heartfelt condolences to the families of those who have lost loved ones and to those who have been injured. The unprecedented scale of the spill and its increasing harmful impact on the Gulf economy and environment demand a thorough examination of BP's actions and inactions, as well as BP's current and future plans. The flow of oil must be stopped. Every day, anywhere from 35,000 to 60,000 barrels are spilling into the Gulf, and only 15,000 barrels a day are being captured. The environmental effects on the oil spill are harming shorelines and coastal wetlands, fisheries and fisheries habitat, as well as marine mammals and sea turtles. What is worse, we will not fully know the ecological ramifications of the oil spill until years down the road. Furthermore, local businesses are suffering great losses, including jobs and revenues that are dependent on tourism that are being threatened. The NOAA announced a revised commercial and recreation fishing closure in the oil-affected portions of the Gulf of Mexico, accounting to 33% of the Gulf of Mexico's exclusive economic zone. As oil continues to flow, this area is sure to enlarge, further exacerbating the economic damage. A recent economic impact study by the American Sport Fishing Association indicated that the entire Gulf were closed to recreational fishing from May through August. The region would lose $1.1 billion in revenue, which supports $2.5 billion in total sales, $1.3 billion in value added, $811.1 million in income, and 18,785 jobs. This potential economic damage is devastating to an area that has already suffered greatly from the aftermath of natural disasters. Americans continue to be frustrated with the lack of management and solutions from all parties involved, and I'm interested to hear more about the coordinated efforts between BP and the administration. The economic and environmental magnitude of this disaster necessitates a clear understanding of what went wrong, and BP needs to be held accountable for the disaster. I also look forward to having MMS and the Department of Interior before this subcommittee for them to answer some tough questioning. I look forward to hearing Mr. Hayward's testimony, and I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Latta. Mr. Ross, 3 minutes opening statement, please, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Stupak, for holding today's hearing to examine BP's actions and decisions that directly led to the tragic explosion and oil spill that continues to gush and wreak havoc on the Gulf Coast at a rate up to over 1,700 gallons per minute. In fact, Mr. Hayward, since this hearing began a little over an hour ago, up to 112,847 gallons have been dumped into the Gulf. On day 59 of this environmental and economic disaster, with up to 60,000 barrels a day spilling into the Gulf, I continue to be frustrated and downright angry by BP's response and lack of a clear and productive plan to stop the leak or efficiently clean up the oil that is destroying the ecosystems that surround the Gulf. Reports have surfaced revealing that in the days and weeks before the explosion, BP knowingly made a number of decisions that increased the danger of an explosion and spill occurring. It seems apparent that BP put profit before safety. Many people are dead. Millions of gallons of oil continue to spew into the Gulf. I'm hopeful that Mr. Hayward can explain today why these decisions were made, how his company's actions led to this disaster, and what they are doing to remedy it. As oil floats into the marshes and onto the beaches, as shrimping vessels sit tied to docks, as restaurants and businesses during their peak season remain without tourists and customers, and as homeowners see their property values plummet, the people and wildlife of the Gulf Coast wait and wonder about how extensive the damage to the ecosystem or the economy will be. This spill is not only affecting the Gulf Coast. The jobs and economies of the surrounding states are hurting as well. My state of Arkansas borders Louisiana, and many of my constituents, people I know in my hometown, work on offshore rigs. These jobs are also at risk, and I hope BP will take responsibility for all those who are affected by this spill, regardless of where they live. and work to help pull them through this disaster as well. This bill is a wake-up call that must result in better government oversight, more advanced technology, stronger response plans, and improved safety standards, not only by BP and every oil company in America, but also by our government. Above all, this disaster is a learning experience that will help us prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again. And I'm hopeful this hearing can provide the answers and solutions necessary to begin that process. Mr. Hayward, I truly hope that you'll give us open and honest answers today and not those prepared by your legal team. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Next, I'd like to call on Ms. Christensen from Virgin Islands for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. The explosion on the Deepwater platform and the subsequent outpouring of hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil into one of the most sensitive and important bodies of water in this country is indeed a tragic accident which caused 11 deaths, many injuries, and will have deep, long-lasting, debilitating, and expensive repercussions. The people of this country need to know what happened and who is responsible. All that has transpired since April 20th says to me that not only BP, but no company that is drilling anywhere in our outer continental shelf is prepared to deal with a spill at this depth. They're all there, applying their best efforts, using the best available technology, and still 59 days later, an end is not in sight. This is not acceptable. What has also become clear is that while BP reportedly used shortcuts they were warned not to, which may turn out to have caused the explosion, the deaths, injuries, and the devastating spill, they're not the only ones at fault. They could not have cut some of those corners without the complicity of employees at some of the responsible government agencies who did not do their job. We're all appalled that lives are lost by decisions made apparently in the interest of cutting costs, but also by the lack of adequate preparation for this worst-case scenario that we are facing today. The fact that the industry did not ensure that response technology kept pace with deeper drill wells lays blame at all of their feet. But we still cannot ignore the decisions made by BP, which, if they had been different, 11 people might still be alive today. We as a Congress, along with our President, who has had more than his share of crises that are not of his making, have some major challenges and critical decisions ahead. I hope that in the name of the 11 who died, the many more who were injured, the affected families, and now those who now depend on OCS platforms for their livelihood, that this and all of the hearings will help us to go beyond a knee-jerk reaction to do the right thing for the region and our country, that BP will be held, and any other responsible party will be held fully accountable and responsible, and that petroleum and natural gas companies learn important lessons that will ensure this does not happen again. I want to thank you, Mr. Hayward, for being here. I look forward to your testimony and full answers to the questions we will ask on behalf of the people in the region and on behalf of the American people. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Welch, opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hayward, in the 59 days since the Deepwater Horizon explosion caused this extraordinary environmental catastrophe and economic catastrophe, we've heard time and again from BP that this was an aberration. The facts, regrettably, tell a very different story. In 2005, when BP's Texas City operation blew up, 15 workers lost their lives. In 2006, a BP oil pipeline in Texas ruptured and spilled 200,000 gallons of crude oil. In 2007, the year you became CEO, the BP Corporation settled a series of criminal charges, not civil charges, criminal charges, and paid $370 million in fines. And according to Risk Metrics independent organization, BP has one of the worst health, environment, and safety records of any company in the world. And in only 1 year, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, found more than 700 violations at BP's Texas City refinery, and BP paid a record $87 million in a fine. An independent review panel charged BP with putting profits before safety. And earlier this year, a BP refinery in Toledo was fined $3 million for willful safety violations, including the use of valves similar to those that contributed to the Texas City blast. And finally, of course, we have the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, and the more evidence that comes in, the more it's clear that event was foreseeable and it was avoidable. After the explosion, BP said there was no oil leaking. Then it said there was 1,000 barrels a day leaking. Then it went to 5,000 barrels. We're now up to 60,000 barrels. For 59 days, Mr. Hayward, BP has told the American people that this was an aberration, that it was a singular occurrence and that it wouldn't happen again. Mr. Hayward, it's not an aberration. For BP, regrettably, this is business as usual. It's deja vu again and again and again and again. And the question I think many of us have is whether a CEO who has presided over a company that has incurred $370 million in criminal fines, whose company, according to independent assessors, has one of the worst records in the world for safety and consistently puts money ahead of safety, whose peers, including Mr. Tillotson from ExxonMobil, who testified where you are 2 days ago, said that Exxon never would have drilled a well the way BP did at Deepwater Horizon, and who as CEO has presided over the destruction of nearly $100 billion in shareholder value and the suspension of an annual $10 billion dividend. Does that leader continue to enjoy and have a valid claim on the trust and confidence of his employees, his shareholders, the public, regulators, and most importantly, the families and small businesses of the Gulf Coast? Or is it time, frankly, for that CEO to consider to submit his resignation? I thank you and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Green for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Haywood, I appreciate your testimony, your being here this morning. And most people on this committee know I'm a big supporter of outer continental shelf drilling and domestic energy production. And I understand from your testimony and our other hearings we've held and meetings with the administration that efforts to cap the well are going as expeditiously as possible. However, like many of my colleagues here, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated that there's been almost 2 months and we still have thousands of barrels of crude oil gushing in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm frustrated by the threat this disaster's impact on our wildlife and coastline. I'm particularly frustrated at this single incident. One well out of 1,000 successful wells of this type have been drilled is threatening my constituents' livelihoods and the livelihoods of most of the communities on the Gulf Coast, literally from Alabama all the way back to Brownsville, Texas. This disaster has called the oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico to shut down. Even if the moratorium does not last 6 months, it will be too late for many of these folks. But these people are not the ones to blame. They're the hardworking people who, with a work ethic like none other, that take their responsibility on these regs seriously. However, according to the investigation this subcommittee has conducted, it's obvious that several BP officials on and off the Deepwater Horizon rig did not take their responsibility to this rig seriously. Halliburton, Schlumberger, and many others warned BP officials that the decisions they were making were bad ones that could lead to serious trouble. And now people are losing their jobs because of the moratorium on drilling. They could have been prevented if BP had not chosen expediency over safety, which brings to my next point. Whether it was the Alaskan pipeline disaster or the Texas City refinery fire where 15 people died, time after time it's been shown that BP chooses expediency over safety. Yet, Mr. Haywood, in your testimony, you write that none of us knows why it happened. However, this subcommittee has uncovered 5 areas where BP made decisions that increase the risk of a blowout to save the company time and expense. I added up the hours that these extra precautionary actions would have taken, and it comes to about 3 to 4 days. That's assuming that many of these actions would not have occurred simultaneously, which way they know they could have. For an extra 3 days of work, men's lives would have been saved, and an industry record of safe and responsible production in the outer continental shelf would still be in place, which brings me to my last point. In your testimony, Mr. Haywood, you say that this incident calls into question whether the oil and gas industry can explore for oil and gas in safer and more reliable ways and what the appropriate regulatory framework for the industry should be. Mr. Haywood, the decisions made by a handful of BP individuals called this into question, not this accident, and you should take the responsibility for the workers who did nothing wrong and are now losing their jobs. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Ms. Sutton for an opening statement, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Stupak. It's been nearly 2 months since the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig resulted in the deaths of 11 workers and injured additional workers. Since that time, we have witnessed the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. a disaster that continues to pour an estimated 60,000 barrels of oil a day into the Gulf of Mexico, a disaster that has led to over 66,000 victims filing claims to receive compensation. Through this subcommittee's work, several alarming decisions by BP have come to light, decisions that were made to save money and time. It's unconscionable when companies pay more attention to their costs and their profits than to their own workers' safety and to our environment. At our last hearing, one witness from Transocean testified that a duplicate blowout preventer system cost roughly $15 million, a system not used on the Deepwater Horizon rig. BP also utilized a more risky option for steel tubing, saving at least $7 million. BP also did not fully circulate drilling mud or secure casing hangers between pipes of different diameters. And critical signals were brushed aside. When standard methods were not followed to center the steel pipe in the drill hole, one of BP's operations drilling engineers remarked in an email, quote, "Who cares? It's done. End of story." But these cut corners have been anything but the end of the story. As the workers and volunteers from around the country help clean up the oil from the disaster, many are becoming ill. Between April 22nd and June 10th, 485 of BP's own workers have been injured. Louisiana Department of Health is reporting 109 illnesses in cleanup workers. And the money and time BP tried to save has long been lost, as they have already paid $81 million in claims. Mr. Hayward, like many Americans, I feel physically sick when I see the clips of the oil gushing in the Gulf, witnessing the devastation of our waters and our coast and the wildlife, thinking about the lives of the workers killed, and hearing and seeing the pain in the faces and the hearts of the people, the families, the small businesses, the fishermen, and others in the Gulf, all consequences of this catastrophe. This culture of carelessness and taking shortcuts to maximize profits at the expense of safety, this come what may, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, attitude is unacceptable, it's outrageous. BP must be accountable for the consequences of that approach, and we must take actions necessary on behalf of the American people to make sure that such a reckless approach will be forever abandoned. The risks and costs to our environment and to the workers in the Gulf Coast, to the workers throughout our economy, are simply too great to allow otherwise. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. That concludes the opening statements of all members of our subcommittee. As I noted in the opening, we have members of the full committee here. I'd like to recognize them. They will be allowed to ask questions by order of seniority. Mr. Hensley is here, member of the committee. Ms. Castor is here. Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Capps, Ms. Harmon, Mr. Weiner, Mr. Melancong, and Mr. Scalise. I'd like to comment, Mr. Melancong and Mr. Scalise are members of our committee. They also hosted us when we had the field hearing in New Orleans a few weeks ago, last week, and we had 9 members go down. It's one of the largest fields hearings we've ever had, so you can see the interest in here. I should also note that Ms. Jackson Lee is with us, not a member of the committee. She will not be allowed to ask questions, but we welcome her, and I know she sat in on previous hearings we've had. So, let's move on with our first witness. Our first witness is Mr. Tony Hayward, who is the Chief Executive Officer of BP PLC. Mr. Hayward, it's the policy of this subcommittee to take all testimony under oath. Please be advised that you have a right under the rules of the House to be advised by counsel during your testimony. Do you wish to be represented by legal counsel? I'm sorry, you're going to have to just press that button right there, sir.
I do not.
Do not. Okay, we also asked, the committee asked if you would have a technical person with you so you could consult if we ask some questions that you want to run it by your technical person. Do you have a technical person with you?
I do.
Could you state his name and position for the record, please?
Mike Zangi, drilling engineer.
Okay. During your testimony, any time if asked a question you want to consult with that individual, please let us know. We'll give you a moment to do so before you answer, but you'd be the only one who could answer the question. Is that clear? Thank you. Then, Mr. Hayward, I'm going to ask you to please rise, raise your right hand, take the oath. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, the matter pending before this committee?
I do.
Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Hayward, you are now under oath. We'd like to hear an opening statement from you. You may submit a longer statement, if you will, for the record, but if you would, please begin your opening statement. And let me again, on behalf of all members of the committee, we appreciate your willingness to appear here today.
Thank you. Chairman Waxman, Chairman Stupak, Ranking Members Barton.
Suspend, please, sir. Ma'am. Before we begin again with Mr. Hayward, let me just again mention those viewers in our audience. Emotions run high on this issue, but we have a hearing to conduct here. We're going to conduct our hearing. It's going to be done with proper decorum. Mr. Hayward, when you're ready, we're going to start the clock over. You may begin.
Chairman Waxman, Chairman Stupak, Ranking Member Barton, Ranking Member Burgess, members of the committee. I'm Tony Hayward, Chief Executive of BP. The explosion and fire aboard the Deepwater Horizon and the resulting oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
Excuse me, Mr. Hayward. I'm going to ask you just to pull that up. Some of the members are having trouble hearing, probably over the clicking of the cameras, but we're having a little trouble hearing you. If you could just pull it a little closer. Thanks.
The explosion and fire aboard the Deepwater Horizon and the resulting oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico never should have happened, and I'm deeply sorry that it did. When I learnt that 11 men had lost their lives, I was personally devastated. 3 weeks ago, I attended a memorial service for those men, and it was a shattering moment. I want to offer my sincere condolences to their friends and families. I can only begin to imagine their sorrow. I understand how serious this situation is. It is a tragedy. I want to speak directly to the people who live and work in the Gulf region. I know that this incident has had a profound impact on your lives and caused great turmoil, and I deeply regret that. I also deeply regret the impact the spill has had on the environment, the wildlife, and the ecosystem of the Gulf. I want to acknowledge the questions that you and the public are rightly asking. How could this happen? How damaging is the spill to the environment? Why is it taking so long to stop the flow of oil and gas into the Gulf? We don't yet have all the answers to these important questions, but I hear and understand the concerns, frustrations, and anger being voiced across the country. And I know that these sentiments will continue until the leak is stopped and until we prove through our actions that we are doing the right thing. Yesterday, we met with the President of the United States and his senior advisors. We discussed how BP could be more constructive in the government's desire to bring more comfort and assurance to the people of the Gulf Coast beyond the activity we've already done. We agreed in that meeting to create a $20 billion claims fund to compensate the affected parties and pay for the costs to federal, state and local governments of the cleanup and environmental mitigation. We said all along that we would pay these costs, and now the American people can be confident that our word is good. I've been to the Gulf Coast. I've met with fishermen, business owners and families. I understand what they're going through, and I promise them, as I'm promising you, that we will make this right. After yesterday's announcement, I hope that they feel we're on the right track. I'm here today because I have a responsibility to the American people to do my best to explain what BP has done, is doing, and will do in the future to respond to this terrible accident. First, we're doing everything we can to secure the well, and in the meantime, contain the flow of oil. We're currently drilling 2 relief wells. We believe they represent the ultimate solution. We expect this to be complete in August. Simultaneously, we've been working on parallel strategies to minimize or stop the flow of oil. While not all of them have been met with success, it appears that our latest containment effort is now containing about 20,000 barrels a day. By the end of June, we expect to have equipment in place to handle between 40 and 50,000 barrels a day, and by mid-July between 60 and 80,000 barrels a day. Second, I've been clear that we will pay all necessary cleanup costs. We've mounted what the Coast Guard has recognized as the largest spill response in history. We've been working hard under the leadership of the Unified Command to stop the oil from coming ashore. And whilst we're grateful these efforts are reducing the impact of the spill, any oil on the shore is deeply distressing. We will be vigilant in our cleanup. Third, as I have made clear from the beginning, we will pay all legitimate claims for losses and damages caused by the spill. Those are not just words. We've already paid out more than $95 million, and we've announced an independent claims facility headed by Ken Feinberg to ensure the process is as fair, transparent, and rapid as possible. Fourth, we need to know what went wrong so that we as a company and we as an industry can do better. That is why, less than 24 hours after the accident, I commissioned a non-privileged investigation. I did it because I want to know what happened, and I want to share the results. Right now, it's simply too early to say what caused the incident. There is still extensive work to do. A full answer must await the outcome of multiple investigations, including the Marine Board. To sum up, I understand the seriousness of the situation and the concerns, frustrations and fears that have been and will continue to be voiced. I know that only actions and results, not mere words, ultimately can give you the confidence you seek. I give my pledge as the leader of BP that we will not rest until we make this right. We're a strong company and no resources will be spared. We and the entire industry will learn from this terrible event and emerge stronger, smarter and safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hayward. One of the bad parts about conducting a hearing, we get interrupted every now and then by votes. And we have 3 votes pending right now. There's, I think, about 10 minutes remaining on this vote. I would suggest, instead of trying to get into questions, we take a break right now. Let's stand in recess for 30 minutes. Let's come back at noon and continue this hearing. We'll start with questions from all the members. Okay?
Okay.
This committee will be in recess until 12 noon.
Right around the extra this morning. And I'll probably go back and monitor the questions going to be. Yeah, but we thought that that was already what they just put the same with me. Yeah, it's one of the questions. You want me to get out of the way? I'd be happy to. Yes, please. But somebody coming out again. It's okay. Let me get up first.